our route to freedom was not just by fighting our own battle, but also working with others to fight their battles so that we collectively could make that change happen. So, for example, the Gay Liberation Front, in many respects, took its model from the African American struggle for civil rights. And I can remember here in London in the early 1970s organising sit-ins in pubs and cafes that refused to serve LGBT people. And that was very much modelled on the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee in the United States in the 1960s and Martin Luther King, who went into the Deep South and demanded to be served at lunch counters and parks and in restaurants that were reserved for white people only. So we borrowed from a successful movement. We saw the success of the Black Civil Rights Movement. We conceived the idea that if black is beautiful, then gay is good. That if black people were an oppressed minority, then so were we. And that was really, really important because we had no template. When I was 17 in 1969, there was no LGBT movement. There was none in Australia where I was born and where I grew up. There was no movement at all. So the reference for me was to look at other movements, how they did it. And for me, the Black Civil Rights Movement in America was pivotal and crucial. Here we are, half a century later. Half a century after Stonewall 1969. A tremendous, unprecedented 5 decades. There has never been a social movement in history that has changed society and global culture so much in such a short space of time as the LGBT plus movement. Take a look at the rainbow flag. It's ubiquitous all around the world. It's one of the most instantly recognizable flags in the world today. Yet it was only invented in 1978. We have put a marker down that has not only uplifted our own community, but has actually fundamentally changed societies. Now, of course, most of these gains so far are in Western countries. And for many other countries outside of the West, their Stonewall has yet to happen, or has happened on a much smaller, less well-known scale. But, in many respects, is even more inspirational. Because in so many countries around the world where LGBT plus movements now operate, they are doing so against the odds of dictatorship and tyranny, of extreme religious fundamentalism, of state repression and mob violence. So when I think about other Stonewall moments, I think of maybe Russia. Russia in 2006 had their Stonewall moment, when for the first time LGBT plus people demanded the right to hold a pride parade in Moscow. That pride parade was refused and banned by the mayor, and when I went there to support those brave, heroic LGBT plus activists, I saw for myself not only the state repression, but the state collusion with neo-Nazis to attack and beat us. Now, I had the protection of a British passport, so I was back on the plane a week later. But the Russian activists had to stay there and live with long-term consequences. Likewise, in so many countries around the world today, we see these battles being fought that we fought decades ago. So in Uganda, where they have striven to hold a pride parade for several years, and indeed twice they have held small pride parades, but often under police threat, and sometimes, or in this one instance, as a result of a violent police raid. To me, it is so inspiring that there are people out there in countries who don't have our freedoms, don't have the protection of a relatively sympathetic media that we have, but who are nevertheless standing up for LGBT plus rights, saying that enough is enough, that they want their freedom too. And some people say that, LGBT plus freedom is a Western issue. No, it's not. It's a universal human rights issue. And we can never, ever rest until every LGBT person on this planet is free and equal. So we look at all the gays who won here in Britain. Fantastic. And they are fantastic. Think about 1999. In 1999, Britain had by volume more anti-gay laws than any country in the world. Some of them dating back centuries. Yet here we are, 2 decades later, we have some of the best laws. Now that's huge, phenomenal progress. That's the biggest, fastest, most successful law reform campaign in British history. But we still have 1/3 of all LGBT plus people who suffer homophobic, biphobic, or transphobic hate crime. Still, 45% of our young kids in schools are victims of bullying. So we have made huge progress. And that's a tribute to all of you and the tens of thousands of unsung, unknown LGBT activists and straight allies and friends. It's a tribute to the collective action that we've made these changes. But for other people in other countries, it is so painful to think of the struggles they are going through right now. So we've witnessed in the last few years a quite unnerving backlash in about 20 or 25 countries. Progress was going forward, then it's been put into reverse. It's happened in Uganda, Iraq, Malaysia, Brunei, Syria, Nigeria, Russia, and particularly Russia's Chechen Republic. And this repression takes two forms. First, it's the more vigorous enforcement of long-standing laws criminalizing same-sex relations and criminalizing gender identity. And this has resulted, for example, in highly publicized arrests in countries such as Tunisia, Cameroon, Egypt, and Senegal. But also, of course, some countries have introduced new anti-LGBT laws, like the one introduced in Russia in 2013, which criminalized the so-called promotion of non-traditional sexual relations to young people under 18. But what's also quite unnerving is the way in which this backlash has spread to countries that previously had no history of anti-LGBT witch hunts, such as Tanzania, Indonesia, and Ethiopia. It's only in the last few years that those three countries have begun quite harsh and vicious crackdowns on their LGBT plus community. But having said that, of course we're seeing great progress. India, Angola, and Trinidad and Tobago, they have decriminalized same-sex relations in the last year. And then in the last week or so, we've seen decriminalization extended to Botswana and Bhutan. Progress is happening. The trend is in the right direction despite the backlash. And of course, before these more recent decriminalizations, we've seen a repeal on same-sex relations in Belize, Palau, Sao Tome and Principe, Northern Cyprus, Mozambique, Nauru, and the Seychelles. In all, over the last 4 decades, more than 40 countries have decriminalized same-sex relations. And of course, right now, there are ongoing attempts to challenge the criminalization of LGBTI people in Jamaica. So we're seeing a trend towards decriminalization. And we're seeing a trend that increasingly it's the courts rather than politicians that are taking the lead. So in Botswana, in India, in Trinidad and Tobago and other countries, it's been the courts that have ruled that the criminalization of same-sex relations is unconstitutional or a violation of human rights. So judges who historically have tended to persecute us are now, in some countries at least, becoming our allies and the instrument of decriminalization. The process of law reform now brings the number of countries that still have a total prohibition on same-sex relations down to 67. 67 countries still criminalize consenting same-sex relations. That is still more than 1/3 of the world's countries. And of course, in more than 36 countries, there are laws that variously criminalize trans and gender non-conforming people. Often these are not laws that are explicitly written to criminalize them, but they're general public decency laws or morality laws which are used to target trans, non-binary and gender diverse people. But again, we are seeing progress. Who would have thought that in Pakistan, trans people would be making gains? Who would have thought that in India, again, the courts have ruled in favour of trans people? Not perfect, not perhaps the way we want it, but given the history of persecution, this is real significant change. Of the 67 countries that still criminalise same-sex relations, 35 are members, or 34 are members of the Commonwealth. 34 out of 54 member states. And these homophobic laws were originally imposed by Britain in the 19th century, in most cases. These are laws that Britain imposed when it was the colonial power in the 19th century and which these countries retained after independence. What is perhaps so shocking, given that the Commonwealth has a Commonwealth Charter which enshrines the principle of universal human rights, non-discrimination, equal treatment, what is so shocking is that despite the Commonwealth Charter, that all these countries still criminalise same-sex relations, and that some of them retain draconian penalties. So, under British-imposed colonial era legislation, there is still a maximum penalty of life imprisonment for homosexuality in Sierra Leone, Tanzania, Pakistan, Uganda, Bangladesh, and Guyana. In fact, Guyana is the only country in South America that still criminalises same-sex relations. We also know that, as I mentioned, the way the backlash is operating is it sometimes involves the more vigorous enforcement of long-standing laws. The other way it operates is, of course, through the enactment of new legislation, like the Russian law in 2013. So, for example, in Nigeria in 2014, a new law was passed which outlawed LGBT plus organizations, outlawed fundraising for LGBT plus causes, and outlawed any public advocacy of equal treatment and non-discrimination for people who are lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender. That same Nigerian law even banned gay-focused HIV prevention. So to even try and educate gay and bisexual men about the risks of HIV became a crime in Nigeria in 2014. And then it went even further to ban all gay-themed books and films. They're totally banned in Nigeria now. In Tanzania, which I mentioned was a country which had previously not had a history of witch hunts, in Tanzania, the government has banned the importation of lubricant because it perceives this as aiding the facilitation of homosexual acts. And it's closed down several HIV organizations that have provided support and care to gay and bisexual men. There are other forms of restrictions. For example, in Uganda, there are state-sponsored censorships against LGBT plus issues. So a radio station, Radio Simba, some years ago, dared to have a lesbian woman speak on one of its programs. And as a result, it received a massive fine and the threat to have it closed down. So this intimidatory atmosphere means that activists in countries like Uganda have great difficulty in getting their voice heard, getting their message out, countering the homophobia that is so prevalent in large sections of that society. But the one thing the Ugandans do have
which is a great virtue and effect, is that the Ugandan LGBT groups are part of a wider coalition, a coalition of civil society groups. So it includes LGBT plus organizations, women's groups, political opposition parties, trade unions, organizations that campaign for ethnic and religious minorities, and they all work together around the fundamental principle of universal human rights. So that when the LGBT plus community is under attack in Uganda, all the other groups in that civil society coalition rally to support. And likewise, when women's rights are under attack, the LGBT groups and others rally to support the rights of women. It's a very, very, very effective strategy which has given the Ugandan groups a fair degree of protection against probably what would be much more severe state repression. We see that in countries where there is this backlash, that LGBT plus people are increasingly demonized and scapegoated by demagogic politicians and fundamentalist clerics. And often it's quite cynical. So I remember a couple of years ago, a spokesperson of Malawi's main opposition party, Ken Masonda, sought to boost his profile and win bigoted votes. And this is what he said: arresting them, LGBT plus people, won't address this problem because sooner or later they will be released on bail. The best way to deal with this problem is to kill them. There was no public outcry in Malawi when he uttered those words. A handful of people, expressed disquiet, but there was no public outcry. There was no response by the state or by other NGOs to condemn that behaviour or those words. If we look at Nigeria and Uganda, we can see that Christian churches there have played a very fundamental role in contributing to the witch hunting atmosphere by echoing prejudice and from the pulpit, but also actively supporting draconian new anti-gay laws. So the anti-gay law I mentioned in Nigeria in 2014, that was being pushed by the Anglican Church of Nigeria. The Anglican Church of Nigeria that our Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby, will be inviting to the next Lambeth Conference. How can you have a Christian church supposedly based upon love and compassion and invite people who actively campaign to undermine the civil and human rights of fellow human beings? Of course, this kind of tactic is an old one. To the delight of many governments, having an enemy within is a very good way of distracting public attention from economic failings and corruption. Hitler tried it with Jewish people. Many others have used it as well. But it is being used now in many countries. Homophobia, biphobia, and transphobia is a political issue that's being manipulated by politicians and clerics to fuel their own agendas. And of course, the consequences are not surprising. We see in many countries the rise of right-wing death squads who get a kudos, a credibility, a legitimacy when mainstream politicians and clerics speak out against the LGBT plus community. So these right-wing death squads operate particularly in countries like Honduras, Brazil, Mexico, Peru, and El Salvador. In Honduras alone, well over 240 LGBT plus activists have been assassinated by right-wing death squads since 2008. So in 11 years, over 200 plus murdered by right-wing death squads. We also have the similar situation in Brazil. Parts of Brazil have laws to protect LGBT people against discrimination. The courts have ruled in favour of same-sex marriage. Yet there are parts of Brazil, particularly in the northeast, where right-wing death squads run amok, where they target LGBT people, particularly trans people, for assassination for what they call social cleansing. So every year in Brazil, at least 300 on average people, mostly trans people, are murdered by these right-wing death squads. The Trans Murder Monitoring Project reports that over 1,300 trans and gender diverse women and men were murdered in Latin America from 2008 to 2014. Over 1,300 in just 6 years, and those are the ones they know about. They're the ones that have come to attention and they've been able to document. The real figure is probably much, much higher. In recent years, the courts in Singapore and Kenya, in fact in Kenya just only a month or so ago, have upheld the criminalization of same-sex relations. A bad, disappointing move. In Burundi and Chad, two African countries, they have outlawed homosexuality for the first time in their history. We all have heard the stories of Islamic State in Syria targeting LGBT plus people for execution, mostly by throwing them off tall buildings. We also know that in Iraq, there are Shia militias and death squads that are also waging a terror campaign against LGBTI people. A few years ago, one of the very disturbing tactics the Shia militias were using in Iraq, and still occasionally use now, is to capture a known or sometimes even just suspected gay man, glue their anus with super glue, and then force feed them laxatives so that their bodies basically swell up and their intestines explode. A gruesome, agonizing, painful form of murder. Just this week, a report has come out, a fantastic, uplifting report, about how a house painter and an army widow in Iraq rescued LGBT plus people. They'd heard about people being held by Islamic State and decided that they wanted to do something to try and rescue them. They didn't know who these people were. Anyway, they went to this house. They managed to persuade the Islamic State people there to let them come in and meet these people, and through an elaborate plan, they managed to get them free. In telling their story, they were very shocked that when they got these mostly men to freedom, they started hugging and kissing each other. They said, what is this all about? Why are these people doing this? And they said, we're LGBT. And they said their first reaction was they thought LGBT was a political party that had been repressed by Saddam Hussein. But anyway, when they learned the story, they weren't put off. They actually continued that campaign and through networks went on to rescue many, many more people who were detained because of their sexual orientation or gender identity. It's a really uplifting story. And the woman who was the, I think, a widow of an army major, I think in Iraq, she was part of the Organization for Women's Freedom in Iraq. And she said, because she knew what Islamic State were doing to women, how they were using religion to persecute and oppress and kill women, that gave her an understanding and an empathy towards the plight of LGBT plus people. That this kind of macho, machismo mentality, which she saw and understood, oppressing women, she understood how it related to people who were trans or LGB. So I think, just to conclude, despite the bleak picture we see, the global trend is towards greater LGBTI acceptance and equality. At times it seems difficult, at times we see these setbacks, but overall the trend is in the right direction. And that's inevitable because we have a just cause, and that this cause, when people can hear the arguments, when people can meet LGBT plus people, eventually, for most of them, those prejudices subside and perhaps they come over to support us. So I want to finish just by, again, paying huge tribute to those many heroic LGBT plus activists in countries where there is religious or political dictatorship, who are literally risking their lives and liberty to secure LGBT plus freedom. Those people are true heroes and heroines, and we know that they will win in the end. The global trend is clear. LGBT plus freedom has been long delayed, but it cannot be denied. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter, for that very informative talk. Let's now move on to our panel discussion. We have some really great questions lined up. Any of you panelists should feel free to chip in on any question, but I might suggest a particular panelist to get us started. All right, so first question is, what impact do events like London Pride have on LGBT rights globally? Do they actually help advance LGBT plus rights elsewhere in the world? Peter, I'd be particularly interested in your take on this, and then perhaps others can chip in.
Can I suggest, since I've just spoken for quite a bit of time, can we let the others have a go?
I think visibility is the most important part in changing views. Knowledge is power. And the great thing about having a Pride celebration is that its background is embedded with the political protest. And it's important not to forget that. But even here in London, having London Pride on the 6th of July doesn't mean that it embraces everyone. I'm not here on speaking on behalf of UK Black Pride. I am the International Rights Officer, UK Black Pride, but I think it's really important that we also have safe spaces for other communities. So, on the 7th of July, Haggerston Park, please come and celebrate in that safe space, because we forget that, I can't believe I'm on a panel where Peter Tatchell is the optimist and I'm the pessimist. There's got to be a first. But you look at the Stonewall Communities report, 51% of BME people feel that they face racism within the LGBT plus community. And with all the advances we've had, and I love the fact that Peter's talking about courts and judges, one for the lawyers here, for affecting change. But we still live in a society, even in London, Meliana and Claire, the bisexual couple on that bus a couple of weeks ago, the other bisexual couple at Nuffield Theatre at Southampton, where I did my undergrad, we're still not safe. So it's great to have that London Pride and Pride events to show focus and visibility and provide an opportunity for us to still continue to protest. Northern Ireland still doesn't have same-sex marriage. We don't live in an equal country. So we still need to protest, but also celebrate to give us that space. So I think it's a very important focus for us to get together, but we can't forget where we've come from. You look at Stonewall 50 years ago, people of color, trans people starting off the embrace. 1971 in New York, a trans woman of color got booed off the stage. 2 years after Stonewall. So that whole sort of overlap between the Black civil rights movement in America and the queer rights movement, that quickly fizzled out when the gay men had their privilege, the white gay men had their privilege and had their space. So we can't forget that. We've got so much more to learn.
Thanks. Anyone else with a take on whether celebrating Pride here in London has an effect globally?
I think as a country that, through colonialism, as Peter said, enforced a great deal of anti-LGBT laws, I think that it is down to us, especially, to set a standard of, this is what we believed then, and this is what we believe now. And I think it sets an example for other countries to look to, especially as we're highly influential here when it comes to LGBT rights. Here in America, especially, within the West, I think that we owe it to people throughout the rest of the world to show how far other countries can come if they become united and fight for what's right. So, yeah.
And I think even when it's not, I grew up in, like Peter, in one of the colonies. I'm South African and grew up there during apartheid, and I didn't know people like me existed. So it was, even though those countries there won't be any press coverage of London Pride or anything like that, but it's hard to erase that many rainbows from Google Images. And so I think we shouldn't forget how many people still feel very alone and don't know that our community even exists. I'm Tito here at Monzo. I ended up in tech because as a young lesbian growing up in apartheid South Africa, Xena Warrior Princess was literally the only gay culture I had access to. And in the 90s, if you wanted to find other lesbians, Xena message boards on the internet.
Amazing.
There's some nods here. Although led to me the very first time I ever went to the States, like going to a Xena convention. I'm admitting that in a room full of people. That's really happening. And which was great, and met a whole bunch of people I'd only ever known online. And it was life-changing for me, literally. So I just had no access to that, to people like me, where I was growing up. It did mean, though, that when I then later revisited the US, and the immigration experience was quite different post 9/11, understandably, and it was a lot less, welcome to the USA, and a lot more, why are you here? Having to go visiting some friends. Where did you meet these friends? On the internet is not the answer you want to give to a US immigration officer, ever. So I was like, last year in California, what were you doing in California? Attending a convention? It's like a huge guy. There's a guy with a gun behind him. I'm very worried about lying to these people, so I'm like, I'm not going to lie. What convention? Xena convention? And this guy, this huge guy, he just like looked at me, raised an eyebrow, and went, Xena Warrior Princess? Yes, sir. And I'm pretty sure there's still a note on my file, right? But like, we forget how it's very easy, I think, if you've grown up here. If you've grown up here in the last 30 years, it's easy to forget how different it still is everywhere else. And we just need to remember that we're still protesting as well as celebrating.
Thanks, Meri. That's a really interesting perspective. Almost every week we see multiple new news stories about LGBT rights somewhere in the world. Some of this news is good, some is bad. So the question is, are we making progress overall? And Peter said in his talk that we are. Chelvan, I was wondering, would you agree with that based on your experience?
I actually don't. And that's why I said this is a really strange panel to be on today. Peter referred to the Johar judgment of India, the Supreme Court judgment in September last year, which liberated 1 billion people, LGBT+. A very good friend of mine was actually the only female lawyer who made the submissions to the Supreme Court in India to liberate LGBT people. And it's amazing, in that judgment, it actually said that the court needed to apologize for the persecution and discrimination LGBT people suffered. But this is not a suntan. I was actually born in a country called Sri Lanka, another ex-colony, which loved colonial laws. And in 1995, there was actually a challenge to the penal provisions in relation to criminalizing same-sex because they were discriminatory, because they only affected men. So the Sri Lankan government said, well, we can't be discriminatory. So they extended the law to cover women. And then, remember, this is a Commonwealth country. In November 2016, there was a challenge by 2 gay men who got prosecuted and imprisoned for 12 months for gross indecency in 2003. It took until 2016 to go to the Supreme Court in Sri Lanka. And the Supreme Court said, look, what's happening in England and Wales, getting rid of their sodomy and buggery laws, we're not like that in Sri Lanka. We actually enforce the law. And what they said is that we're not going to do 12 months imprisonment because this is the first offense. So we're going to double it to 24 months and 5 years suspended on the basis that it will give those men or women who, private or public, are prosecuted, an opportunity to reform. So they actually talked about gay cure therapy in a Supreme Court judgment in the Commonwealth. Now, Peter talked about Botswana, great judgment on the 11th of June, saying that, public morality cannot override individual rights. But Peter also talked about the Kenyan High Court judgment on the 24th of May. Now, in 2010, Kenya changed its constitution. And in Article 45, subsection 2, I'm in a room full of nerds, so I'm going to state the subsections. In subsection 2, it said marriage is between people of the opposite sex. And the Kenyan High Court said in May 2019, they upheld the constitutionality of the Article 164, the colonial law criminalizing consensual gay sex for up to 14 years, by saying, look, there's no conclusive scientific evidence to show that gay people are born that way. That's paragraph 392. And they said, if we strike down this law as being unconstitutional, we're going against what the Kenyan people decided in 2010, because what will happen is that if we decriminalize, gay people will live together. Seriously, this is what they said. And if gay people live together, we're undermining what the Constitution held by saying that gay people can't marry. Yeah? So this is a Commonwealth country which is actually enforcing the laws by not relying on the colonial era legislation, but saying we, the Kenyan people, have decided that marriage is only between man and a woman. And therefore, if we decriminalize, if we allow privacy, liberty, dignity, we will actually undermine what our people want to hold as being right. So for every step forward, we still have countries, we have 13 states or parts of the state which actually prescribe the death penalty. Mauritania, Sudan, Saudi Arabia, Yemen, and Iran, you're put to death. Yeah. So all these countries where we've seen changes, we also see other countries which are hardening the rules. Look at Brunei. Sultan of Brunei even said about introducing the Sharia penal provisions in 2014. Why has it taken the global north until now to actually react? We've had nearly 5 years. Yeah. So we've got to be careful in relation to this battle. It's not all rainbow dancing with, even with the black and brown stripes to be added to the rainbow flag, which I hope we're all going to be doing. But we live in a world, especially with the people seeking asylum who come to the UK to seek protection, where it's a very dangerous world to be LGBT+.
Thanks, Chelvan. Following on from what you and Peter said, you mentioned that most of the progress that's been made around the world with gay rights actually has been coming from court decisions rather than legislatures. I'm just wondering, do you think there's any risk that the courts decriminalizing these things when society perhaps isn't quite there yet? Do you think that could result in political backlash of any kind that propels somebody, into power that then reverses those decisions? And have you seen that anywhere?
Me, I think that this is a question for you two, the much more well versed in the law.
You have another go, Chelvan.
Look, we talk about the Labour government, yeah? Wonderful gay rights champions, yeah? I'm going to make a little slight political statement here, yeah? But look at the work Stonewall had to do, throughout the 90s and 2000s. Age of consent, Ian Sutherland. Yeah, it was only because we took courts to Europe, and I am pro-Europe, that we took courts to Europe, to Strasbourg, to the Court of Justice, that we actually forced governments. Tony Blair actually defended gays in the armed forces, a ban on openly gay and lesbian people serving in the armed forces. It was only through court cases did we actually force their position. Civil partnerships, different game. But a lot of the changes, trans rights, Gender Recognition Act, all issues regarding pension rights of trans people, Court of Justice in Europe. Yeah, so we seem to forget that a lot of the changes we've had have been started by people within our community standing up and fighting the state, and then these court decisions, in effect, forcing a change within the legislation, within the politicians, to allow us that safe space to be able to be visible and stand up. Yes, you see what's happening with Trump America. Yeah, I'm never going to be allowed to go in after this statement. We see what's happening with Clarence Thomas, one of the Supreme Court judges, a couple of days ago, said quite clearly that the decision in 2015, Obenkopf, which said about same-sex marriage, could be overturned. He actually said publicly that the Supreme Court should not be bound by its earlier decisions. And we see what's happening with Roe and Wade and the anti-abortion and what the number of states are doing. So we see a very dangerous trend in that part of the global north. Do I see it happening here? No. I honestly don't see that happening here because we've made too much progress. We're not part of that stage which have political appointments to judges. Yeah? And we always have our check and balances. You can see what's happened with politics. But I do believe that you do need to sometimes push social change for change to actually happen.
Thanks for that. Anyone else with a go on?
So I've personally experienced living in places where, so I was here when civil partnerships came in, and that was very much, it felt like social change had, to some extent, happened, and that had led to the legislative change. But as I mentioned, from South Africa, and South Africa had full same-sex marriage before the UK, which a lot of people are surprised by. I was pretty surprised by it too, to be honest. And it came about because a lesbian couple took the government to court, and it went all the way to the Supreme Court. And because our constitution was so recently written with Mandela's involvement, if we're really fucking honest, it's very progressive. It was written in the 90s. And so they found it to be unconstitutional that that we couldn't get married. And there's obviously a lot of very recent history in South Africa with different, like, interracial marriages not being legal, interracial relationships not being legal. And so it felt very resonant for a lot of people. Even people who are very homophobic could see that this was very similar to this very recent history of that happening. But the legal change happening has not particularly helped the social change happen back at home. So we have a huge corrective rape problem where women in particular are raped by their by family members and friends to try and fix them in South Africa. And so on the one hand, I'm very glad that High Court decision, the Supreme Court decision happened, and they gave the South African government a year to bring in same-sex marriage. And the opposing viewpoint was, we could have made it legal today, so be glad you got a year, which is a very unusual kind of position for a court in South Africa to take. But it hasn't necessarily helped us to make the social change happen, which I see much more evidence of here. I think, ironically, one of the things that's probably helped us the most is Caster Semenya, because she is such a celebrity and such a hero in South Africa. Like, people will forgive you anything if you're good at a sport in South Africa. Genuinely. It's clearly where I went wrong. Wasn't good enough at water polo. But in some ways, her visibility is what is helping us the most in that social change finally happening. Even though we've had same-sex marriage for over a decade, it's some of her visibility and how people who, like, frankly, are really horrible and racist and homophobic, and they still aren't going to take anybody else, like, taking a medal away from Caster Semenya. And so it's very interesting to watch which things change with the legalities changing and which things change with this kind of celebrity or social or visibility, I suppose.
Would you have anything to add on that, Peter, on the interplay between societal change and legal change?
I think it's all been said, and I want to hear questions and contributions to the floor.
Yeah. All right. One final pre-baked question before we take audience questions. A few weeks ago, a group of men in Boston applied to the city government to hold a straight pride in August, arguing that straight people are an oppressed group. Do advocates of straight pride have any legitimate point at all? And what do you think is driving this? Munroe, I'd be particularly interested in your take on that.
I think driving it is a lack of understanding of the state of play of where the gay rights movement or the queer rights movement and the nuances of that and how that came into fruition. And I think it's a lack of understanding, it's a lack of respect. It's, again, echoing the social standing of reactions to towards queer people. And the rights may be there, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the social understanding's there. And I think that that's echoing that the social understanding is not there. And also I think that it shows that people aren't aware of just how dire situations are for a lot of people within the West still that are trans especially. The amount of Black transgender women that are being killed in America alone is staggering. There's been 5 Black transgender women that have been murdered alone in the last month. since Pride Month started. From people being shot to death and then dragged from lakes, being found in the street. Largely, these Black transgender women have been forced into sex work to survive, which is ironic, seeing as Black transgender women that were involved in sex work are responsible for the whole gay liberation movements being sparked at Stonewall. So it's a lack of understanding largely, but then also it's homophobia essentially. It's seeing a movement and people being empowered within that movement and feeling threatened by it to the extent where you feel, well, why can't I feel emboldened to be homophobic? Because what's there to be proud of to be straight? I don't understand, like, what, I mean, it's, do you know what I mean? It's, sorry, that sounded a lot worse than it's meant to sound. Of course, everyone should be proud of being themselves, but to be proud of being gay is being proud of being defiant of, you know, oppression and being proud of where you've come from. Straight people haven't had to endure that kind of struggle. No one's being oppressed on behalf of being straight. So where's that pride coming from? That's what I meant.
Well, thanks for breaking that down for us. That's it's really interesting.
That's just one perspective.
You asked what's behind it, and there's a fantastic quote that I'm going to completely fail to attribute correctly, which is, when you're accustomed to privilege, equality feels like oppression.
Yes.
And I think that's exactly what's happening. If you haven't seen, there's a fantastic little video somebody did on Twitter, like being excited and calling her boyfriend about straight pride. It is hilarious, and you should find. I'll tweet it out in a bit. But yeah, if you want the wonderful, like, funny but also very serious 5 points against the straight pride argument, it's a very good encapsulation of them.
Thanks, Meri. Well, let's take some audience questions now. Who wants to start?
So eager. I've never seen hands go up so quick at a Q&A.
Yeah, so if you could just try to keep your question brief.
Impressive.
Keep your question brief and say whether you'd like the panel generally to answer it or a specific panelist.
So my question is, what ways have you seen Pride change, and do you think it's keeping up with how society is changing, or that it's moved away from what it stemmed from?
Can I answer that one? I am really glad to see very recently, Pride, especially in this country and New York especially, becoming a lot more political and politically minded, and not only just with regards to the day itself, but everything surrounding Pride, to the commercialization of Pride especially, and breaking down, yes, now we've got much more visibility within the media, but with that comes responsibility and corporate responsibility. And how are we going to be involved within the media without watering down the fact that this is a movement? And how are we going to bring about political change without just being the illusion of change? So I'm really excited to see that, especially as someone who does work with fashion and beauty brands. I'm really mindful of that. I'm mindful of the responsibility that I have to provide a precedent, largely because a lot of the companies that I'm working with, I'm the first trans person to work with that company. So how I work with that company is setting the standard for how they work with queer people or trans people, especially when I'm dead and gone. So it's a big responsibility that I think a lot of people are putting on their backs right now, because it's being done for the first time. So I think that we can work with corporations with Pride. I think it's essential that we do, because straight people work with corporations anyway, and we can use that as visibility, as an educational tool. But we do need to be really mindful of the fact that it is a political movement, it is a protest, and it should always be a political movement and a protest.
A question to Peter and perhaps Chelvan as well. You mentioned Uganda.
Wow.
I'm so sorry.
Are you all right, mate? You okay? We probably have a first aider in the house.
That's a lawsuit.
I went to an LGBT plus panel and I got bashed. That's not the headline we were looking for here tonight. Are you okay? Seriously, we've got like first aiders and stuff. You sure?
Is it hard?
All right. Okay. Sorry. So my question was about Uganda and other countries sort of in the global south. My understanding was that a lot of the backlash against LGBT rights in that country in particular was due to powerful forces from particularly the United States, religious and political, certain religious groups that were funding these sort of anti-LGBT rights organizations. And my question, Jen, was how much of this backlash around the world is sort of internal and comes from within the country, and how much of it is sponsored by powerful international actors such as religious groups or certain political parties in certain states like Saudi Arabia or the United States?
I think it's true that in most instances it's an internal generated backlash. So, is it working?
Yes.
It is, okay. But there are some instances like Uganda, to some extent Nigeria, where external forces, mostly religious, have planted the seeds of prejudice among clerics and politicians who previously were not engaged in a witch hunt. So, for example, there is a section within the Anglican Communion called GAFCON, which is basically a group of, quite a substantial group of bishops and archbishops in the Anglican Church who are primarily motivated by the hostility to LGBT plus rights. It's the cement for their organization. And they do send people to countries all around the world to try and stir up opposition to LGBT plus equality, and take with them videos and books and so on, which give a very sordid, very sick, very depraved view of LGBT plus life. And that is then taken up by politicians and clerics in those countries. So I think that's a minority of instances. But I think a lot of politicians in some countries have realized that finding an enemy within, a group of people who can be demonized and scapegoated, is a very useful political device to appeal to prejudice, to distract from their own particular other economic or political failings.
I think what we also saw is that with Uganda, with the anti-homosexuality bill 2009, so you have what was happening in America. They were losing the battle. The religious right was losing the battle because of Obama. They were losing the battle back home, so they export their homophobia and transphobia to countries where they can feel they can grow the population, grow the movement. And that's why Uganda, even Nigeria 2014. But we don't see that much in the press now with what's happening back in America. We don't see that drive in relation to the global south from these organizations. That doesn't mean it's not happening. And it's important to note that those groups, those homophobic bigots, those transphobic bigots in the countries of the global south have always been there. They've always been vocal, they've always marginalized, they've always silenced us. And what has actually driven them is not these groups, these NGOs, these religious groups in the global north, it's their fear of progress in these other countries. And that was quite interesting to see the Botswana and Kenya, what's happened there. Is that we thought that Kenya would decriminalize. That's what we all hoped, because a Kenyan NGO got status a couple of years ago. So to see what happened in Kenya was a huge shock, but to see what's happened conversely in Botswana and Mozambique is a candle in the wind. So it's too easy to say, oh, it's the religious groups, it's these global north state actors, whilst not concentrating on the fact that we've got to look at empowering grassroots activists in those countries to be able to change their lives. That was a wonderful thing about seeing the cases such as in India. These were Indian lawyers going to Indian courts, changing colonial laws. I'm a huge supporter of the fact it's not just a message, but who delivers the message. Yeah? I think it's really great that we're having this conversation in London, but I don't think it's for global north actors to stand up saying, oh, the colonial laws are really bad, we've got to change them. No, sorry, we don't want the global north savior. We want to empower people in the global south to be able to empower themselves.
And we shouldn't underestimate how frustrating it is for the organizations in those places. There's an amazing one called Isra Al-Shafai in Bahrain, and the organization she's part of, they run a thing called Mid East Beats, which is Middle Eastern protest rap. It's amazing, but also a social network for LGBT plus folks in the Middle East, which it's really fascinating in that it's had safety aspects baked in from the very beginning because of the risk of blackmail, of murder, and similar. It's frankly something Facebook could learn a hell of a lot about from them. But they are endlessly frustrated by Western VCs and so on, not wanting to support them financially, not wanting to actually give the help that they need, which is, you know, servers to run things on and money to get the work done, but wanting to come and tell them how to do it. They know how to do it. They need money, resources, donations of the things that will be useful, not some Silicon Valley consultant to turn up and tell them that they're coding it wrong. And the like white fragility that causes that kind of behavior is something we have to speak up against as well.
There's an amazing, sorry, cutting onto you. I was going to pile onto your comment. There's an amazing Instagram called No White Saviors as well, which is phenomenal. And it really spells out exactly how white people largely should be helping Africa, rather than going over there and participating and largely stroking their egos and making ourselves feel better as Western people. It's not solely just white people, it's the West, how the West should be helping Africa. Sorry.
Thanks, all.
I'd like to understand what's your take on the involvement of financial services industry or legal services industry in promoting LGBT rights, and how creating an event like this at a bank to discuss what's essentially human right different to another company trying to jump on a bandwagon and make some profit out of Pride Month. Hollister and Gap releasing the whole Pride collection at charging overpriced rates for what should be just a standard price, or M&S releasing LGBT sandwich suddenly to celebrate the Pride Month. How does it tie in with general promotion and belief in what should be a universal human right?
I don't believe that it does. Putting a rainbow flag on a sandwich, I don't believe that it does. And I think that's the conversation that we're having at the moment. Just making sure that we are setting a standard for prides to come, saying that, you know, if you are going to be making money out of the LGBT community, you need to be either providing a platform to represent that community in innovative, groundbreaking or aspirational ways, or you're just benefiting from that community, which is then furthering the oppression. So I think that that's a conversation that's happening at the moment, but it is definitely in progress because a lot of companies are getting it wrong.
I mean, for the record, I think here this isn't organised by anybody in Monzo's PR department or anything. This is a bunch of us who are queer employees feeling it was important to have this conversation. So I hope that we've struck the right note to it. I think Kieran's done a lot of good work to organise it. But I agree that just rainbow painting everything and trying to jump on the bandwagon isn't helpful. But maybe creating space in which it's normalized for all employees at all companies to talk about this kind of stuff, and for it to be a thing that companies not just create space for but actively support, I think is important, because most of us have day jobs too, right?
Yeah, well, Meri speaks for me on this as well. But I know, Peter, you had some interesting ideas about the sort of commercialization of Pride when you came here last year. What's your take on the question?
Well, first of all, let me say that I was one of about 30 or 40 people who helped organise the first ever Pride in the UK in 1972. And it was a carnival parade, but no corporate sponsorship, but also with a very strong political message. And I think that compared to the early Pride parades, the ones we have now are basically celebrations, which are fine, but are really lacking in any political focus. there's no real clear message. Like years ago, we would have, pride parades which might flag up the unequal age of consent or the parenting rights of lesbian and bisexual women, challenging Section 28. There was often a specific theme, a human rights theme, to try and use pride as a way of projecting that message to the media and the wider public. Nowadays, you've got these anodyne sort of generic sort of themes which are pretty meaningless. And I think it's a great wasted opportunity. If we're just looking at Britain alone, the theme of this year's Pride should be marriage equality in Northern Ireland, or should be, better improved relationship and sex education in schools for LGBT plus and even for straight people. Or we should pick a global theme, have a global theme that's in solidarity and supporting and amplifying and giving a platform to activists from the global south. So I think there's many, many lost opportunities. In terms of corporate and commercial sponsorship, I'm not against it in principle, but I think the fundamental plan of Pride in London is basically flawed. If Pride was just a political carnival protest like the first one in 1972, there'd be virtually no costs at all. When they had a big march against Brexit or against austerity, the organisers didn't have to pay anything. But because the Pride organisers have allowed themselves to be bullied by the Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, the head of Westminster City Council, and the Metropolitan Police Commissioner, they've ended up paying onerous costs and charges that are not and would not be applied if it was simply a carnivalesque political protest. So, for example, the Mayor of London has imposed a limit of 30,000 people in the parade. That's completely against the ethos of Pride, which is an open, inclusive space for everyone who wants to come along. So last year, over 20,000 people who applied were turned away. And that was the tip of the iceberg. Back in the 1990s, there were 100,000 people plus on the Pride parades. They took more than 5 hours to pass a single point. There were 300,000 in the post-Pride party on Clapham Common in 1997. Pride has been suffocated and diminished by the city authorities. So, for example, Westminster City Council demands charges for street closures, for barriers. Even if you go along the street and they have to suspend the parking bays, Pride is billed for the revenue that would have been raised if a car was parked there for the duration of the parade. This is naked exploitation of Pride by the city authorities. And the police are in on it as well. For them, it's an issue of convenience. The smaller and more manageable the march is, the better it is for them. So they want something small and containable. That's not what Pride's supposed to be about. And, the big issue, of course, is that once you have commercial sponsorship, and in particular, once you have motorized floats in the parade, then you do have to start incurring charges because there are health and safety issues, vehicle control issues. And of course, when the city authorities see that Pride is sponsored, they think, oh, we want some of that. We want some of that money. So they start upping the charges. So I would like to see us to go back to the 1972 model, which is we have a celebratory, joyful, exuberant parade, but no motorized vehicles. And, if commercial interests or business people want to participate, that's great. But they shouldn't dominate the parade. And last year, if you looked at London Pride, it was the big corporates that dominated the visual image because they were the only ones that could afford the gigantic floats. The extravagance, the money, the cost, they're the only ones that had it. So the community groups were relatively invisibilized. Now, I'm not saying that what I'm suggesting is the only way or the way, but I think we need to have a new conversation about this because I think Pride has lost its way. And I think we need to rediscover the radical roots of Stonewall 1969 and the first Prides.
Thanks,
Peter. That's real food for thought. I know that we're supporting, as a company, some of our employees to go to Trans Pride in Brighton this year. And I get the impression that it's a lot less commercialized, it's a lot more grassroots. Munroe, I was wondering what's your take on this? Do you think trans rights have been less commercialized to date?
Absolutely. But I think as a response to that, Pride has got the essence of what Pride should be and what Pride was. And when you go to Trans Pride, it's all about, speaking about the state of play, about what trans people are going through. You can hear very distinctly over speakers people's experiences and people responding to those experiences, and people giving feedback about like what is acceptable, what's not acceptable. You leave that space feeling like you are more well informed about where we need to go as a community, and you feel much more part of that community. When you go to Pride in London, certain spaces, it feels like a street party, and it could be anything. It is sad to see that part of it, but that has come largely as a response of people not really knowing why we have Pride in the first place. People know why we have Trans Pride now because it's such a pressing issue, but because largely white gay men haven't been facing the same kind of oppression that other people within the LGBT community are facing right now, there's been this sense of complacency, I feel, for a very long time. And it's only really recently now that we're starting to feel that urgency again, because we've realized that, these rights that we've become accustomed to can be wound back. And I think, growing up, we were feeling, I don't think that we'll go back. And you said that, I don't think that we'll go back, but I think that there's a chance that we could be, especially with, idiots like Boris Johnson verging on coming into taking the Prime Minister role with his opinion on gay men and his opinion on Muslim women. And I dread to think what he thinks about trans women. So, I think that the more pressing the issue, the more organic Pride will be. And if something like equal marriage got round back, then I can guarantee you that Pride would be much more grassroots, and people wouldn't be paying attention to the rules and regulations. They would be doing it anyway. They'll be taking Pride back for themselves rather than waiting to be told what to do.
Well, can I give a different take? My first Pride was 25 years ago. Yeah, black don't crack. Yeah, it looks good. And I remember being a student and going on this Pride and worrying. Got it? Well done. Worrying about having the TV cameras see me go on that Pride march, because in that time it's all about being closeted and not being visible. Now, I quite like Pride. I love marching in Pride, and I march with various groups, including the lawyers, but also the LGBT plus refugees. And the reaction we get when we walk through Pride from the crowd shows that the crowd don't forget what Pride's about. There's huge cheering, there's huge applause. So whilst there is a bit of a commercial aspect, I don't think that we as a community forget what Pride's about, that we do support those who are oppressed, that we do support each other. So, once again, there's a twist here, because I'm actually an optimist about Pride. I think we do need time and space to celebrate about who we are. I quite like seeing some of the floats. It will never look like any one of those go-go boys. But, it's quite nice to look at. I'll be honest about that. That makes me queer. But the important point is that, if we just get to a political march, we're not allowing those people who come from the, I grew up in Worthing, come from these places where you don't have that space to dance and celebrate. And
there's no Worthing Pride?
No, not yet. Maybe we should start one. The Portsmouth Pride for the first time last weekend. So I think we've got to have a symbiosis of both. Yeah. The political and the celebratory. Because I know as that young student going into that Pride March, where it was 5 hours and it was one sort of rite of passage, that, you were worried about being invisible. Yeah, and then worry about. And so we've got to be able to take on all aspects of our identities and celebrate.
And I think that's the key point, right? It's the intersectionality, being ready for the elements of this that are. I was, as a lesbian, immensely disappointed in how the protest at the the anti-trans protest at the beginning of London Pride last year was dealt with very poorly. And I think there's a responsibility to, none of us are equal till all of us are equal, right? And so there was a much more of a responsibility to deal with that much more proactively and much better. I'm a huge supporter of UK Black Pride and delighted to see that on the ascendant and getting so much support now.
Shout out to
Genuinely
Lady
should go. It's an amazing event.
Thank you.
But yeah,
Thank you.
not stopping when we've only dealt with part of the community is very important.
Oh, can I just add, sorry, with Peter's point about a point being driven home within Pride. Last year, Manchester Pride added the black and brown stripes to its flag, and the response to that was shocking. People saying that race shouldn't be put into Pride when race should be a primary concern, because LGBT POC are marginalised against a far greater sense or far greater rate, or whatever what my word is, I'm not really with it today, but far greater rate than our white peers. And I think that reaction shows that people don't understand the crux of Pride as well. So I would have to say that I agree with Peter in terms of how we can reform Pride and how we should be drilling home that it's an opportunity to change things and change pressing issues that we're facing at the moment.
Thanks, Munroe. Let's have another question, maybe from this side of the room.
Hello. I actually wanted to talk a little bit more about what you're saying. You're a lawyer, and you're protecting people from being sent away from our country. I wondered, as an ex-colonial power, if we have a responsibility to our previous colonial countries, not in a way that we don't want to be those white saviors, but in a way of reparations, or if that can come specifically for the LGBT community, not just necessarily economically, but in other ways. I know recently in England, people were pardoned for being criminalized for being gay. Do we see something similar coming for people being targeted in ex-colonial countries?
Yeah, it's quite the Alan Turing law you're referring to in relation to pardon for criminal past criminal convictions. Last year was Chelvan in London in April, and both Peter and I were protesting outside the Commonwealth headquarters, and Theresa May, for the first time, said sorry, in effect, for the colonial laws which were part of British legacy. Will that ever lead to reparations? I don't think that we're ever going to have that happen. I think we've got to be realist. But I think what we can do instead is, realize, and I believe that criminal laws by themselves amount to persecution. Yeah, because we know, I mean, I'm from a generation, grew up, 1989 April. I knew I was different. Age of consent was 21. Yeah, every time I had sex with another human being who happened to be male, I was committing a criminal act. Even though the law wasn't actually being enforced at that time, it was that fear. So I do believe that we should get to a stage where we accept that having the criminal laws on those books in those countries is enough to mount to persecution, and we give those people safety and refuge. Yeah, that's what I'd like to see. Will we see that? No, because the politicians would worry about floodgates. The judges will worry about floodgates, that people from 69 or 77 countries come into this country claiming asylum just on the basis of criminal laws in those countries. But I think we forget, I think non-queer people forget that these laws provide that chilling effect, that climate of fear, which allows for harm to occur. So that's what I'd like to see.
Can I say that the chances of reparations, I think, are pretty slim. The government here won't even agree to compensate gay and bisexual men who are prosecuted under our historic anti-gay laws. So my foundation has been running a campaign for the last year, pressing the government to agree compensation similar to what the German government has agreed, where men who are prosecuted and convicted for consenting adult same-sex behavior should receive some form of compensation. And for some of those men, the consequences were truly, truly devastating. I think of the case of a guy I've known for some years, Stephen Close. He was in the army in the 1980s, and in 1983, he was found out to be gay, and he was given a 6 months prison sentence in Colchester military prison, even though his behavior would not have been a crime if it was between two civilians. And that was a very, very harsh prison regime. And when he came out, he tried to get a new job, and he couldn't, because he had to account for where he'd been working for the last few years, and he was given a dishonorable discharge with disgrace. So for 30 years, he was either unemployed or did low-paid menial jobs. For 30 years. It's only in the last few years he's got a decent job for the first time in 3 decades. So the personal cost for men like him was so, so great. I mean, he was driven almost to suicide. He had periods of extreme mental breakdown. People like him deserve compensation. Also, looking at reparations internationally, I mean, so many bad things were done during the colonial era. And as you may be aware of the legal case that I and others have been supporting for many, many years to get compensation for Kenyan nationalists who were interned without trial during the so-called Mau Mau insurgency in the 1950s, when Kenyan people were demanding independence, self-rule. Thousands of them were locked up. Tens of thousands were locked up in quasi-concentration camps where they were beaten, denied proper food and medical treatment, raped, and sometimes even killed. And it's only just recently the courts here have agreed that there is a case to answer and those people should receive some form of compensation. But the compensation being offered is absolutely derisory, given what some of them went through. And you can replicate the same story in Yemen, which is another British colony, in Malaya. The list goes on and on. I mean, in Malaya, we set up concentration camps to herd people, uproot them from their villages, put them in these camps, so-called protected villages, which were under British military control, where horrendous abuses took place. And, there are photographs, even still circulating on the internet, of British soldiers who captured suspected communists and decapitated them and held up their heads as trophies. And none of these soldiers have ever been prosecuted, and none of the victims or their loved ones have ever received a penny of compensation. And this was against the communists in Malaya, who fought with the British Army against Japan and helped liberate Southeast Asia from the Japanese. 1 minute the communists were our heroes and allies, the next minute, as soon as the war was over, they became the victims of horrendous human rights abuses.
Thank you, Peter. I think we had a question.
Just to
Gently.
just to probably wrap up and ask if we could take one action today, each one of us, what would this be to help those who are still struggling?
Knowledge is power. Knowledge is power. Yeah? Learn as much as you possibly can, because that gives you the power to be able to empower others.
I would say that it's, I don't think that there is one thing that you can say, because it's such a diverse, nuanced situation. I think that would be the takeaway, just that there isn't an answer, just like one answer. It's a continuous thing that you need, as you said, it's continuously absorbing the information and making sure that you're aware. I've learned so much today. So I would say go to more things like this, educate yourself, throw yourself into community talks, and try to be of service in whatever you're good at. I think I'm often asked, what can I do to be an effective ally? And I think it really comes down to applying your skill set to help a community that is in need. So whether or not that's you're good at tech, whether it's good at sport. There was a boy, or a man even, sorry, a man that raised up to, I think it was like £500,000 or dollars for a mermaid charity who were being dragged through the conservative press.
He's a gamer, yeah.
A gamer who played Donkey Kong from start to finish. And he utilized the fact that he was good at playing video games to raise much needed funds for a trans kids charity that are not state funded. And especially in a time when the British press is so transphobic, especially the Times newspaper. And people aren't really aware even of how transphobic the media is. So in a time when we're trans issues are pretty new to a lot of people, when they're reading a newspaper such as the Times, they're thinking, oh, this must be fact, because the Times is a reputable source, but they're not breaking down or even really digging into it. So I think it's about deconstructing the information that you receive or that you come into contact with, but making sure that you are the one going to the information, not the information coming to you.
I have two things. Don't be a bystander, but actively go learn how to intervene. It's very difficult to react in the moment to seeing something happen and trying to intervene. I, in a previous life, was a bouncer, and genuinely some of the stuff I learned and how to deal with violence as a bouncer has been genuinely helpful when trying to stop racist attacks, homophobic attacks happening in front of me. And so you can look up online how to prepare yourself and how to rehearse mentally for doing something, because many of us see something happen, wish we could do something about it, but haven't done enough prep to do that. And every one of you can go and prep on how to intervene. Don't leave someone enduring a racist or homophobic or transphobic attack. You could stop it. And the other would be just, sorry, I'm not going to do so. I'm going to go.
Oh,
Sorry, I was self-censoring.
I would say do a little bit of research about LGBT movements in the global south who are really struggling and under pressure, and then use your own social media to amplify their voices, to tell their stories, to publicize what they're doing, and if you can afford it, make a small donation, because in the global south, 10 or 20 pounds goes a long way, and organizations there are really, really struggling. I can remember back in the 1980s when they were trying to set up the first LGBT plus group in Thailand. They invited me out there to give them advice, and I said, well, I'm happy to come out, but I need to bring things, what do you need? And they needed just simple things, a mobile phone, a computer, money to help fund internet connection, very basic office equipment. And through working with other people in the LGBT plus community, we were able to raise that money to give them the infrastructure to get established and to go on and do great things. So I think that'd be my ask and my suggestion.
Thank you, panel. Maybe one final question from the gentleman with the mic.
I didn't realize this was Mike. Hi, I have a question. So I was struck by what Peter said about in the beginning, the movement was very much a shared movement between, persons of color, women, etc. And also by the point that, Pride needs to have a political movement behind it or a point behind it so that everybody can collectively, push for something. So back home, so I'm from the Philippines. The Pride Parade this year is entitled Resist Together. And so it's very much in line with that. But one of the challenges that they encounter is that there's so much to fight for. I mean, people are being shot on the streets, being accused of, drug dealers, women are being abused, minority groups, etc., fishermen, all types of human rights abuses. And so I guess my question is there a risk of there being a loss of focus in that there's so much to fight for? Like, where do you begin? Where do you start? How do you prevent, the women from fighting with the LGBTQ groups to, in some ways, vying for attention for what should be at the forefront of the movement? I guess
Thank
that's
you.
sort of a...
Who wants to take that question?
Well, I'll just perhaps reiterate what I said when I spoke earlier, that the Ugandan model is a very effective one, where they have this coalition of NGOs and human rights and civil society groups who all work together to support each other. That's a really effective model, because obviously unity is strength. If you're working together with all the other people, if you can support them and they can support you, then collectively you're all stronger. But I think it's really up to each movement, each country to decide what its priority is. So in lots of countries, same-sex marriage is not a priority. It's way down the list. But, decriminalisation, the simple legal framework of protection against discrimination, housing, employment, healthcare. Those are much bigger priorities in many countries, and I think that will vary in each different country. Different countries have different priorities, but I think it's up to them. And with Pride, it's every year, so you can have a different theme each year. So one time you can do about maybe parenting rights or trans rights or whatever, and the next year you do something else.
One thing that we've seen be successful in some countries is to find the building blocks that will help everybody. So freedom of right to assemble, an equivalent to freedom of speech, disregarding how the US has twisted that. But there are a bunch of things where there are specific initial interventions that will help every group, and then the kind of take the spotlight one at a time and amplify approach that Peter described, I think we've seen be very successful in a number of different countries as they try to organize together and resist and change things.
We were actually having a conversation before we came down here, and speaking about how a lot of the people that are discriminative against LGBT people don't necessarily care if you're bi, gay, or trans. It's the fact that you're not straight. So I would argue that, again, yes, we can pick a theme, but we need to drive home the issue of unity, and the fact that if it's not you, then it will be me, and if it's not me, then it'll be her or it'll be him. So we can't be divided. So I think that can be an overarching theme, but then we need to look at the most marginalized parts of our community, which largely are transgender women of color, but not limited to. So we can, I think it's about developing conversations, not being limited to just that issue, because if it's not that issue, then it'll be something else. So again, yeah, unity.
Unity through diversity.
Thank you, panel. Well, thank you, panelists, and thanks for all of you for joining us. Let's have a round of applause for our panelists and our audience.